This is a brief overview on evidence-based supervision, which you'll be reading about a lot this semester. It also serves as an opportunity to remind you that you'll need to pull in everything you've learned in your other courses as you learn how to engage in evidence-based supervision. I want to make sure that you understand that evidence-based supervision is different than evidence-based practice, although there is a lot of overlap. If you're confused about this distinction, I would reach out to your instructor who can help clarify for you. Evidence-based supervision is a 7-step process and it's outlined in your supervisor's guidebook, and it describes how we should perform our job as supervisors. Like I said, everything this term is about applying what you've learned with clients to the supervision process. But remember, just like every client is different, your staff is going to come to you with different knowledge and skills, and they'll be expected to develop skills in some different ways. So for example, you might have RBTs, you might have BCABAs in training, you could have BCBAs in training, or you might have other professionals that you provide some level of supervision for. And so you're going to expect each of them to come to that training, to come to that job with a different skill set, with a different knowledge set, and what you're wanting from them is going to be somewhat different. So let's go through the 7 steps. Step 1 is identifying desired consumer outcomes. So this means that it shouldn't just be the next thing in your standard protocol. It should be individualized. People say individualized all the time, and then they just pull out the same book and do the exact same protocols over and over again. It should be based on the unique needs of that client. Ideally, it should also involve input from the client, and if the client isn't capable of contributing to that process themselves, then other care providers, parents, teachers, other people who share their community life with the client should be involved in identifying what are desired consumer outcomes. Desired consumer outcomes should be socially valid. Go back and review social validity in your previous textbooks to remind you about what social validity is. You're going to learn more about social validity later this term, but you'll want to review it now so you're prepared for those materials and so that you can appreciate this part as a foundation of evidence-based supervision. Step 2, specify what your staff must do to assist your clients in attaining desired outcomes. Staff members often require a range of skills to create environments in which clients can achieve their goals. And so you have to make sure that you're clear in specifying what the staff have to be able to do, what skills they need to assist your clients. Good supervisors identify what behaviors staff have to demonstrate in order to produce those client-identified outcomes. And so it's not just that you have this idea of what good staff members do, it's what good staff members do to produce the client outcomes that you want. And again, those client outcomes should be individualized and ideally involve client input. So many of these involve implementing interventions with a high degree of treatment integrity. So a lot of your staff have to, that's the primary goal. But you should also be setting as a goal things like, how do they demonstrate respect to their clients? How much do they offer opportunities for independence and self-determination? How much do they create an environment that enhances quality of life? And so if you're only looking at a checklist for treatment fidelity, you've probably lost sight of what the client fully needs. When you lose sight of what the client fully needs, you can't support your staff sufficiently to help the client reach the quality of life that they deserve. All right, step 3. Training your staff in the performance of skills that you've specified in step 2. So our major project this term, as you already know, is your training project. And we're going to spend an enormous amount of time talking about training this term. Suffice it to say, we need to do more than just hope our staff have these skills. You have to have a very specific training process that's evidence-based. For your training project, you're going to focus on direct care staff, and these direct care staff are going to have an educational and experiential level that's very different from your own and might be very different from the place that you work right now. Why do we set it up this way? Because if you can learn to work with direct care staff who maybe have limited English proficiency, who have limited reading proficiency, who are facing unique challenges like transportation problems, you are better prepared to train those folks. You can do, really, you can train anybody once you learn how to train the more challenging people that you'll work with during your career. Although it's more challenging to work with them because of these limited proficiencies, it's also really cool and exciting to see how much growth they can make and how incredibly professional they can be and skilled in performing their duties, as long as you give them the proper supports. When completing training, your organization should begin with training staff to perform skills to accurately implement interventions. But remember, we're going to have staff at multiple levels, so you can't just focus on treatment fidelity. Your more advanced staff are probably going to need a lot of different skills. So for example, someday you may be training a student just like yourself, a student studying to be a behavior analyst. You need to make sure that they acquire all the skills needed to meet the minimum expectation for behavior analysts. And an example of that might be teaching them how to select the right intervention at the right moment, how to incorporate all of the client and contextual variables that are needed to identify a treatment that's going to produce the optimal outcomes. Okay, so where you're training your staff is going to be dependent in part on what the expectation for the position that they're currently in, and also where is it they're wanting to take their career. Step 4, monitoring staff performance. So you've already mastered the idea of data collection before taking this class. If you need a reminder, go back and look at the materials from your single subject research design course. Look at your Cooper text. Make sure you know these materials. And I will tell you, make sure you understand them fluently and you're able to identify what is the best data collection, or what is the best measurement system for collecting data, and why. Supervision of human service staff requires that you generalize your data collection skills to this other population, direct care staff. So how are you going to measure progress toward accurate implementation of interventions, for example, or even things like keeping the area clean or paperwork completed on time? How are you going to generalize your data collection skills to this other population? You need to be able to assess the situation and select the correct data collection process. That means that everything you've learned about data collection, you still need to apply to your staff. You just need to think about what's the appropriate measurement system, what's the best way to graph and analyze your data as needed. All right, step 5, supporting proficient staff performance. Just like you provide support to your clients when you want them to attain skills, you now have to identify what are the best supports for your direct care staff so they can perform their job efficiently and effectively. So we're going to spend a lot of time on these methods this term, connecting it to behavioral skills training and coaching and performance feedback. But know that the same type of methods you use with clients also apply with your staff. So for example, you still need to be thinking about the ABCs. What are the behaviors you want? What are the antecedent conditions that you create? And what are the consequences, primarily reinforcement, that you need to use if you want to maintain strong staff performance? Step 6, correcting non-proficient staff performance. Not every staff member is going to perform their job to criterion. And I think something that's important to remember is that even a staff member who performs some skills to criterion might not perform other skills to criterion, or someone who's been great and performed to criterion for a long time might slip suddenly and not perform to criterion. So just as you do with clients, you should ask yourself if this is a skill deficit or performance deficit. That is a non-proficient performance because they can't do it or because they won't do it. You already know if it's a skill deficit, you want to see what additional supports you need to help them acquire those skills so they can perform at the required level. But if it's a performance deficit, it's about arranging contingencies differently. And you need to think about arranging contingencies differently for staff, just like you do with clients. Just like you don't blame a client if they're not acquiring a skill or not demonstrating a skill, you assume it's the environment isn't supporting the appropriate behavior. You need to look at the same issue for your staff. If they are performing in a substandard way or non-proficient staff performance, what you need to think about is how do I arrange the environment differently so that they can be successful. We'll learn more about how to address staff skill and performance deficits during the term. But I want to point out, you probably won't hear people use those phrases, skill deficit and performance deficit, but it is important for you to conceptualize non-proficient staff performance in the same way, just like you do with a client, so that you can match the right approach to the right situation. Our last step, step 7, is to continuously evaluate staff performance and consumer outcome attainment. A supervisor's job is never done. Assessment is crucial for ensuring performance continues. Are you familiar with the idea of treatment drift? Some people call it procedural drift. It's when a person who was previously implementing an intervention correctly has stopped doing so. That is, they've drifted away from correct implementation. Again, you don't blame the person. You look to see what is supporting correct implementation, what supports are needed now. So that means you're going to continue to follow these steps throughout your entire career as a supervisor, and that you need to assess everyone, even those who have previously performed at very high levels. Sometimes people will overlook certain staff members because they've historically been very good, and that's a real problem. I also want to point out why it's important. Sometimes you'll have behaviors that you target that might come in conflict with each other. I'll give you an example. I remember when I ran a center, and I felt like every other week I was giving feedback about delivery of reinforcement at a rich enough schedule. And then the next week would be delivering a large enough number of SDs during the session. So what would happen? People would deliver a lot of commands, and they would forget to deliver reinforcement at a rich enough schedule. But then, once I was really focusing on delivering reinforcers, they started doing that. The magnitude of the reinforcers were too great, so they were delivering reinforcement for, instead of 15 or 30 seconds, they were delivering it for a minute. And so what would end up happening is the number of commands was reduced, so the learning opportunities were reduced. And so even looking at what you are emphasizing as a supervisor and how that can influence other behaviors that you want to target, and regularly bringing this up and continuously evaluating is essential. So I hope this video explains the basics of evidence-based supervision, but also underscores how important it is for you to have mastered materials in your previous courses before taking this course. I've talked about the importance of social validity, knowledge of data collection systems, skill versus performance deficits, antecedent conditions, reinforcement, and procedural drift. You'll need to bring everything you've learned in your previous ABA courses to the current task, generalizing your skills to a different population. Direct care staff. So you need to make sure that you understand concepts related to generalization too. So these are some of the things that you've got plenty of work to do this semester, but in your downtime, I do recommend pulling out your Cooper book or another book that you really rely on, and reviewing many of these concepts again and thinking about how would you relate these to supervision.